Your company on Newsday. Our next guest on the program is Liberal Senator James Paterson, joining us from our Melbourne studio. Senator, thanks for your time as ever. And it looks like you're not in Melbourne. It looks like you're in Sydney there.
Sydney, in fact.
Can I just get your take? Indeed. Can I just get your take? How do you think the economy is travelling right now in the light of the figures out today on growth?
Well, those people who made bold predictions in the last few days that we would have a negative quarter of economic growth, I think have a little bit of egg on their faces. We're a long way away from that, with a growth rate of 0.5% in the most recent quarter and an annualised rate of 1.4%. Certainly we would all like the economy to be growing even faster than that. But considering the global economic headwinds that we face as a country, and considering the difficult circumstances we're in with the trade conflict between the United States and China, actually that underlying rate of growth is pretty strong and points to some real resilience in our economy. It doesn't mean we're out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination and we can't be complacent, but I think a lot of people will be somewhat relieved by the relatively strong result today.
Strong, even though it's the slowest growth since the GFC. Strong seems a strange word to put with that.
Oh, well, I don't think it's strange at all, Tom. I said relative to where we are as a global economy right now. I mean, there are other countries in the world, particularly Europe, that are going backwards and at an increasing rate. So for Australia's continued economic growth now entering its 29th year, a global world record, that's an impressive thing, and we should be proud of that as Australians, but cognizant of the ongoing challenges that we will face.
The Prime Minister and Treasurer have been urging us to look at the next quarter ending in September because the tax cuts kick in then. We have had, though, a month of retail data that says retail is shrinking. That can't be a good sign, can it, that tax cut's going to have a big impact?
Well, let's not judge a quarter of data before it's even concluded, let alone delivered to the government and released to the public. As you say, Tom, the personal income tax cuts, which are some of the largest personal income tax cuts in years, were delivered in that quarter. And the second of the Reserve Bank's interest rate cuts were also delivered in that quarter. And the first one will be flowing through more strongly. So I think there's reason to believe that that will be a stronger quarter, but of course we don't know the numbers yet and we won't know until about December.
Right, but at that point, is this a watching brief? And if that's well below what is expected, the government should consider bringing something forward?
Well, the government's always keenly watching the performance of the Australian economy, and we are always working very hard to deliver the best economic growth we can for Australians, because beneath all these kind of headline figures, Tom, are actual real lived experience of the Australian people and their livelihoods that we're concerned about. So creating new jobs is a top priority of the government, and strong economic growth is at the centrepiece of our economic plans. Just imagine what would have happened if we had had a different outcome in the election, and right now we had a shortened government trying to legislate hundreds of billions of dollars of tax increases. The economy would be absolutely poleaxed. So I'm very glad that didn't happen.
You have been managing the economy for a lot of years, though. In terms of what does happen September and onwards, voters would want to know that you do have a plan B. Is that fair enough?
Well, Tom, I think voters will expect that we're watching the global events very closely, that we are strongly putting the case to both China and the United States that resolution of their trade conflict is in their interests, in our interests, and the interest of the global economy. And if that uncertainty is removed, I think you'll find a lot of the anxiety in other Western economies will also be removed. I was in New Zealand last week on a delegation, Tom, and they're in a very similar position to us. They've got a relatively strong domestic economy, 3.9% unemployment rate, which is very impressive, but they have the same fears, being a small, open, trade-exposed economy that's reliant on exports to countries including China, about what that means for them. So certainly the resolution of that issue is in all of our interests.
And it is, but it hasn't been resolved so far, and it's been dragging on for a long time now. Again, is it fair enough that voters would expect you to have a plan B on the economy?
Well, governments all the time are working on plans to support economic growth and job creation. We've obviously got the budget coming up in May next year. We will have a mid-year economic and fiscal outlook statement in December, and sometimes there are policy changes announced around that time in that statement. So that's the next few signposts to look for, Tom.
All right, well, we'll look for them. Brexit, let's turn our focus to something I'm sure you're glad you're not managing. How badly is this going for Boris Johnson?
Well, Tom, I'll take off my parliamentary hat and put on my amateur political analyst hat and say what a fascinating time to be observing British politics. There's been nothing like it. Boris Johnson is clearly going for a crash or crash through approach. Basically going to the British people to ask them to resolve the deadlock that the Parliament has been unable to resolve for a number of years. It's a bold move, but certainly from an outsider's perspective, you can understand why he's decided to do that. Brexit was not being delivered by this Parliament, as the people had overwhelmingly voted for 2 and a bit years ago. So he's left with only one option, and it'll be fascinating to see how that goes.
What's the best result from here for Britain and for Australia?
Well, I think Australia's interests are served by restoring the close economic ties that we once had with the United Kingdom that were severed when they joined the European Economic Community. The preferential trading arrangements that we used to have with them, they had to give up, and we had to give up when they joined that bloc, because the EU sets its trade policy as a whole and individual countries can't have their own trade policies. So the sooner that we can negotiate a free-to-trade agreement with Britain, the better. It should be a pretty straightforward agreement that we should be able to negotiate relatively quickly, because we're both free trading nations, and Britain is looking for friends and allies to sign those agreements as soon as possible.
Well, that'd be the easy part out of Brexit, though. But what about a no-deal Brexit, for example? All the other implications that would have, surely as an overall, that wouldn't be a great result for the global economy and for Australia as a result.
Well, I think I have to say, Tom, that frankly, many of the predictions being made about that seem a little bit outlandish to me, that the British supermarkets will run out of food and pharmacies will run out of medicine. Australia's not in the European Union, and we somehow seem to be able to stock our shelves with food and medicine. I don't think it's the be-all and end-all. There certainly might be some transitional issues, and the Johnson government has said it's not their first preference to have a no-deal exit. They would rather leave on better terms with a deal with the European Union.
But he wants it on the table.
But they've also said, as you say, Tom, that if they have to choose between no Brexit and a no-deal Brexit, well, they'll certainly go for the latter.
Finally, the situation in Hong Kong has led to the Greens saying currently, or perhaps even if it gets worse as well, that Australia should consider offering Hong Kong citizens Australian citizenship as well. Should that be on the table?
I'm deeply, deeply concerned about the events in Hong Kong, Tom. As you say, they seem to be getting worse and not better, and some of the footage that's come out of Hong Kong in the last 24 and 48 hours is deeply shocking, particularly what appears to be very heavy-handed police tactics towards student protesters, some very disturbing images. So I've got an enormous, deep well of sympathy for the people of Hong Kong and the cause that they are fighting for. And without answering specifically your question, Tom, dodging it slightly, I should say that free people anywhere in the world who find themselves in difficult circumstances should always look to countries like Australia to be a safe haven for them.
Could it be the situation of a one-off, as we saw, for example, with Australia having that one-off for Syrians?
I don't want to speculate too much about events that have not yet happened, Tom, except to say that we are a generous country that has in the past opened our arms generously to people fleeing persecution, people fleeing state-sponsored terror. And if we're called upon to do so again for these people or any others, I'm sure that we'll act accordingly.
What does it say about China, what we're seeing there?
Well, it's a very disturbing series of events. Hong Kong was promised autonomy under the one country, two systems rule. They were promised that the rule of law and democracy and free press and the right to protest would be protected for a number of years under the transitional arrangements. It seems increasingly that that deal is not being adhered to, and I understand the fear of the people of Hong Kong. Australia contemplated our own extradition treaty with China, and I think we're wise not to agree to it, given the problems of the Chinese legal system. So I understand completely why they don't want to have that, and the symbol that that represents about Chinese control effectively over Hong Kong.
Senator James Paterson, always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.